I am Clara. I am 32 years old, and exactly 3 weeks ago, I made the horrifying discovery that my entire existence had been constructed upon a foundation of absolute lies, meticulously documented in my recently deceased father's own handwriting. My father passed away on a dreary Tuesday morning. I was the solitary person sitting beside his hospital bed, holding his fragile hand when his chest finally stopped rising. My older sister, Victoria, was vacationing at an exclusive coastal resort with her socialite friends. My mother, Beatrice, was pacing nervously in the sterile waiting room, claiming she was entirely too emotionally overwhelmed to be physically present in his final moments. At the formal reading of his will, sitting in a heavily mahogany-paneled room surrounded by extended relatives I barely recognized, the estate lawyer officially announced my financial inheritance, exactly $1 single. My sister Victoria received a staggering $2.4 million, the sprawling family estate, and absolutely everything else of value. But a mere 3 days later, while I was numbly packing away the contents of my father's dark, oak-paneled study, I accidentally triggered a hidden compartment inside his massive desk. Resting in the dark hollow was a sealed envelope dated the exact day I was brought into this world. The very first sentence written on the aged paper read, "I absolutely never wanted a second daughter." I sat on the floor and kept reading. By the time I reached the bottom of the final page, the entire, devastating puzzle of my life finally made horrifying sense. Before I take you through the explosive sequence of events that permanently shattered my family, please take a brief moment to engage with this video, but only if you genuinely connect with this story of betrayal and ultimate vindication. And please, drop a comment below letting me know exactly where in the world you are tuning in from and what time it currently is on your clock. I genuinely love reading those responses. Now, I need to pull you backward in time to exactly 4 weeks ago, to the chaotic, terrifying night my father was abruptly admitted to the cardiac intensive care unit. I was just finishing up an exhausting, late-night shift at the corporate accounting firm when my cell phone vibrated violently against my desk. The screen illuminated with my mother's name. She absolutely never called my personal number unless she required a massive favor or a crisis had erupted. "Your father has just been rushed to the Metropolitan Hospital," she announced, her voice entirely flat and transactional. "Severe cardiac arrest. You should immediately drive over there." It was absolutely not phrased as a plea for comfort. It was not a mother reaching out to her child in fear. It was simply a cold, logistical command. I immediately asked about Victoria's whereabouts. "Your sister is currently out of state at the coastal resort with her friends. She simply cannot manage to secure a flight back tonight." Of course she couldn't. It would completely ruin her curated vacation aesthetic. "What about you, Mom?" I asked, my voice tight. A long, heavy pause hung over the cellular connection. "I will drive over there first thing in the morning. It is incredibly late, and I desperately need to make some urgent administrative phone calls." I did not waste my breath arguing with her. I had painfully learned decades ago that attempting to argue with my mother was exactly like screaming into a suffocating, soundproof void. I blindly grabbed my car keys and practically sprinted to my vehicle. I drove for nearly 4 hours through the pitch-black night, the empty interstate stretching endlessly into the darkness. I gripped the leather steering wheel with such ferocity that my knuckles throbbed with pain. I desperately, pathetically kept repeating a mantra in my head. This time would absolutely be different. This time, as he faced his own mortality, perhaps he would finally look at me and truly see my worth. When I finally arrived at the massive hospital complex, the harsh, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a swarm of exhausted, mechanical insects. A sympathetic nurse quietly directed me toward the cardiac intensive care ward. I walked slowly past dozens of glass-walled rooms filled with sobbing families, people fervently praying, and loved ones desperately holding hands. My father's private room was completely, terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the life support monitors. He looked impossibly small and frail under the stark white hospital sheets. The imposing, terrifying man who had cast a massive, suffocating shadow over my entire childhood, the patriarch whose minimal approval I had desperately, pathetically chased for 32 agonizing years, now simply appeared weak and entirely human. I pulled a stiff plastic chair up to the railing and sat closely beside him. "Hey, Dad," I whispered into the quiet room. "It's me, Clara." His eyelids fluttered slightly, but he did not open his eyes. I tentatively reached out and took his cold, papery hand in mine. It was a physical gesture of affection I had absolutely not performed since I was a tiny, hopeful child. "I am right here," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I came to see you." The machines continued their steady, indifferent beeping. Outside the heavy door, the massive hospital hummed with the chaotic energy of life and death. But inside that sterile room, it was just me, sitting completely alone with the father who had never, not a single time in my entire existence, looked me in the eye and told me he loved me. And I sat there and waited for 3 entire days. That is exactly how long I maintained my vigil by his bedside, refusing to leave the hospital grounds. Victoria managed to call my phone exactly once. "How's his condition? Is he currently conscious?" "Not yet," I replied, rubbing my exhausted eyes. "The surgical team says his status is incredibly critical and touch and go." "Okay, please ensure you keep me constantly updated. I have a massive charity luncheon scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, but I suppose I can attempt to rearrange my calendar if it becomes absolutely necessary." "It is completely fine, Victoria," I sighed, the exhaustion seeping into my bones. "I have the situation handled here." She did not offer a single word of protest or offer to relieve me. My mother visited the room for perhaps 2 hours each afternoon. She would sit rigidly in the corner armchair, aggressively scrolling through her smartphone, occasionally letting out a heavy, martyred sigh. Not a single time did she offer to sit by his side so I could go home, shower, and sleep in a real bed. During those incredibly long, agonizingly quiet night shifts, deeply buried memories began to violently surface in my mind unbidden. I remembered my university graduation ceremony. I had desperately scanned the massive, cheering crowd for my parents' faces, finally spotting them slipping into the very back row nearly 20 minutes after my name had been called. Victoria had apparently decided she desperately required a brand new luxury vehicle that exact morning, and they had prioritized taking her to the dealership over attending my academic milestone. I vividly remembered my 16th birthday. My father had completely, entirely forgotten the date. When I quietly, hesitantly reminded him during a silent dinner, he simply reached into his wallet, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and slid it dismissively across the dining table. "Go buy yourself something nice," he grunted, returning his attention to his meal. That was the entirety of the celebration. Absolutely no cake. No singing. Just a crumpled bill and the agonizing sound of Victoria laughing loudly in the next room about the brand new, top-of-the-line laptop they had just gifted her for absolutely no reason at all. On the second night of my vigil, a sympathetic night nurse stopped by to check his intravenous lines. She looked down at me, taking in the dark, bruised circles under my eyes and the wrinkled clothes I had been wearing for 48 hours, and offered a soft, pitying smile. "You are an incredibly wonderful, dedicated daughter for staying by his side like this," she whispered. I honestly did not know how to respond to her kindness. Was I truly a wonderful daughter, or was I simply a pathetic, broken woman still desperately starving for a crumb of paternal affection? On the third, agonizing night, my father finally stirred. His heavy eyelids fluttered open, his gaze clouded with deep medical confusion, frantically scanning the sterile room until his eyes finally locked onto my face. "Victoria," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound. I swallowed the massive, painful lump in my throat. "No, Dad," I corrected him softly. "It's Clara." His eyes immediately drifted shut again, as if the reality of my presence was deeply disappointing. And in his restless, medicated sleep, he continuously murmured a single name. Just one specific name, over and over again into the darkness. Victoria. Only Victoria. I tightened my grip on his cold hand and forced myself to pretend I did not hear the rejection. The very next morning, the dynamic drastically shifted. He woke up completely, terrifyingly lucid. And for the absolute first time in my entire 32 years of existence, He looked directly into my eyes as if he desperately, urgently needed to communicate something of vital importance. "CLA," his voice was barely a rough, agonizing rasp. I leaned in incredibly close, my ear almost touching his mouth. "The massive desk," he choked out, struggling for air. "In my private study. There is something hidden." He began to violently cough, a wet, terrifyingly rattling sound that made my stomach aggressively clench with panic. "What exactly is it, Dad? What is hidden inside the study?" His weak hand suddenly squeezed my fingers with an incredibly surprising, desperate strength. "You absolutely need to find the bottom drawer. The hidden compartment." Suddenly, the medical monitors surrounding the bed began to shriek with a terrifying, rapid tempo. A nurse violently pushed the door open and rushed in, followed almost immediately by another. Someone in the hallway screamed for the attending physician. Dad, please stay with me," I begged, panic finally breaking through my exhaustion. "Dad, hold on." His wide, terrified eyes locked fiercely onto mine. For one brief, agonizing microsecond, I saw an emotion swimming in their depths that I had absolutely never witnessed before. Was it profound regret? Was it suffocating guilt? I honestly could not decipher it in the chaos. "I am so incredibly sorry," he breathed, the words barely audible over the alarms. "I am so entirely." And then the primary heart monitor let out a continuous, flat, screaming tone. The small room instantly flooded with desperate medical personnel. A doctor aggressively pulled me backward, physically moving me away from his bed. "Sir, Mr. Vance, stay with us, clear." But he was already entirely gone. At exactly 3:47 in the morning, my father permanently departed this earth with his hand desperately reaching toward mine, and a massive, life-altering confession left entirely unfinished. I stood completely frozen, pressed against the cold wall in the far corner of the room, while the medical staff clinically recorded his official time of death. I watched in absolute, numb silence while they systematically powered down the shrieking machines, while a heavy, suffocating silence violently filled the exact physical space where his labored breathing had been just moments prior. When I finally possessed the strength to walk into the hallway and call my mother, she immediately began to theatrically weep over the cellular connection. But her very first, urgent words to me were, "You must call your sister immediately. Victoria absolutely needs to be informed right away." She did not ask, "Are you emotionally okay, Clara?" She did not say, "I am so deeply sorry I chose not to be there with you." I numbly dialed Victoria's number next. She finally answered on the fourth ring, her voice thick and groggy with expensive sleep. "Victoria, Dad is officially gone," I stated, my voice devoid of any inflection. A long, heavy pause hung on the line. Then, her tone sharpened with deep irritation. "Why on earth did you not call me significantly sooner? You are perfectly aware I have a massive board meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock this morning." I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call without offering a single word in response. I walked out the sliding glass doors of the hospital lobby. Outside, the early morning sun was just beginning to aggressively bleed over the horizon. It was a brand new day. A world that permanently no longer contained my father. I logically knew I should have felt profound, earth-shattering grief. Perhaps, deep down, a tiny part of me did. But predominantly, I just felt that overwhelming, familiar, freezing emptiness. The dark, hollow void where his unconditional love should have resided for 3 decades. And endlessly echoing against the walls of my exhausted skull were his frantic, unfinished dying words, the massive desk, the hidden compartment. The subsequent funeral service was an absolute, meticulously curated spectacle. Harrison Vance had been a highly respected, deeply feared corporate businessman in our city. Over 300 people crammed into the sprawling, Gothic church. Elite corporate colleagues, wealthy country club associates, and distant, aristocratic relatives I had never once laid eyes on. Every single person in attendance eagerly offered a polished, glowing anecdote about what an incredibly generous, brilliant, and honorable titan of industry my father had been. I sat silently in the second pew. I was intentionally relegated to the second row, seated directly behind distant cousins I only encountered once a decade, and directly behind my mother's gossiping friends from her exclusive social club. Victoria stood prominently at the very front of the church, positioned shoulder to shoulder with my mother, graciously receiving hushed condolences exactly like a grieving royal family greeting their loyal subjects. They were uniformly dressed in immaculate, matching black designer couture. I was wearing a basic, unbranded black dress I had purchased on clearance at a mid-tier department store over 5 years ago. When the solemn moment arrived for the formal eulogy to be delivered, I slowly stood up from my pew. I had spent hours the previous night meticulously preparing something. A collection of pleasant, generic memories. A polite expression of gratitude. It was the exact type of respectful, sanitized speech a grieving daughter was socially expected to provide. My mother's hand shot out like a striking snake, aggressively gripping my wrist and violently yanking me back down into the wooden pew. "Let your sister handle the public speaking," she hissed venomously into my ear. "You know perfectly well how incredibly awkward and nervous you become in front of large, important crowds." I opened my mouth to fiercely protest the insult. "Please, Clara, absolutely not today. Do not embarrass us," she commanded. I slowly sank back down onto the hardwood. Victoria confidently approached the podium and delivered a breathtakingly beautiful, highly theatrical eulogy. She delicately wept at all the perfectly scripted, emotionally resonant moments. She spoke eloquently about our father's profound wisdom, his legendary financial generosity, and his fierce, unconditional love for his family. Unconditional. I stared blankly down at my intertwined hands and swallowed the bitter bile rising in my throat. Following the sprawling, opulent burial service, as the hundreds of guests milled about the manicured estate grounds offering hollow, rehearsed comfort, an older woman deliberately approached me. She appeared to be in her early 60s, possessing incredibly sharp, calculating blue eyes and silver hair pulled back into a severe, uncompromising knot. "You are Clara, aren't you?" she asked, her tone entirely devoid of the usual saccharine pity. I offered a slow nod, desperately trying to place her sharp facial features within my mental catalog of relatives. "I am Josephine," she stated plainly. "I am your father's biological sister." "Sister?" I blurted out, genuine shock breaking through my numb facade. Dad explicitly told me his only sibling tragically died over 2 decades ago. I see. Harrison meticulously maintained that particular, vicious lie until the bitter end, Josephine replied, her voice dripping with ancient, calcified bitterness. He aggressively cut me entirely out of his life and this family 25 years ago, simply because I possessed the audacity to ask entirely too many probing questions regarding his finances. She swiftly reached into her designer handbag and pressed a heavy, embossed business card directly into my palm. "Call my private line the exact moment this ridiculous, theatrical circus finally concludes. There are massive, foundational truths you desperately need to know about the man your father truly was." Before I could even formulate a response, she turned on her heel and seamlessly vanished back into the sea of black mourning clothes. I looked down at the heavy cardstock in my hand. It displayed a secure phone number and 3 specific words hastily scrawled in ink beneath it. "Do not trust them." Exactly 3 days later, our immediate family gathered in an incredibly intimidating, mahogany-paneled law office located in the heart of the financial district. The air in the room smelled aggressively of expensive leather-bound books and ancient, generational money. My mother sat imperiously at the absolute head of the massive, polished conference table. Victoria sat directly to her right, accompanied by her wealthy, arrogant husband, Richard, on her other side. A small, select handful of prominent relatives filled the remaining leather chairs, individuals I recognized from the front rows of the funeral, all watching the proceedings with barely concealed, greedy interest. I was intentionally seated at the absolute far end of the long table, situated closest to the exit door. The senior estate lawyer, a distinguished, gray-haired gentleman named Mr. Sterling, meticulously adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began formally reading the binding legal document. "To my beloved, devoted wife, Beatrice, I legally bequeath the sprawling summer estate located in the Hamptons, alongside a massive, tax-free monthly living allowance to be perpetually managed by the corporate estate trustees. My mother delicately dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. To my eldest daughter, Victoria Vance Collins, I legally bequeath the primary family residence located at 47 Oakwood Drive, currently appraised at a market value of $1.2 million. Additionally, I bequeath the entirety of my aggressive investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $800,000, my private liquid savings accounts totaling $400,000, my entire collection of vintage luxury vehicles, and all premium jewelry and personal effects not explicitly otherwise specified in this document. Victoria reached out and tightly squeezed Richard's hand, her facial expression carefully, sociopathically neutral, hiding her immense, triumphant satisfaction. Mr. Sterling awkwardly cleared his throat, shuffling the heavy parchment papers in front of him. And to my younger daughter, Clara Vance. The massive conference room instantly went completely, terrifyingly still. You could literally hear a pin drop on the carpet. I legally bequeath the sum of exactly $1. Someone at the table actually laughed. It was a short, sharp, cruel sound that was quickly, but intentionally, stifled. I physically felt every single pair of eyes in that room violently snap toward me. Some held looks of performative pity, some gleamed with open amusement, and some radiated pure, unadulterated satisfaction at my ultimate humiliation. My mother simply stared blankly straight ahead at the mahogany wall. Victoria was casually examining the perfection of her expensive manicure. "Is that the absolute entirety of it?" I asked. My voice emerged from my throat sounding infinitely steadier and colder than I ever expected it to. Mr. Sterling offered a slow, grim nod of confirmation. "That represents the absolute, complete entirety of the estate's financial distribution as legally directed by your late father." I slowly stood up. The heavy wooden legs of my chair scraped aggressively against the floorboards, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "Thank you so much for your valuable time today, gentlemen." I turned and confidently walked toward the exit without casting a single glance backward. But just as I reached the heavy oak door, I clearly heard it. A specific cousin's venomous whisper, intentionally pitched loudly enough to ensure it reached my ears. I am honestly not surprised in the slightest. She was never genuinely considered one of us anyway. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, and I finally allowed my lungs to desperately pull in a massive breath of air. The massive dusk. The hidden compartment. It was officially time to discover exactly what explosive secret my father had been desperately trying to confess to me on his deathbed. I aggressively drove my vehicle directly to my parents' sprawling estate. No, I violently corrected myself. It was strictly my mother's estate now, later that exact same afternoon. I repeatedly lied to myself during the drive, claiming I was simply dropping by to collect a few lingering boxes of my old childhood belongings. That is the pathetic excuse I desperately tried to believe. My mother eventually answered the heavy front door wearing a silk bathrobe, looking every inch the tragically exhausted, grieving widow. "Clara," she sighed, her tone laced with deep irritation. "I absolutely did not expect you to show up here today. I simply need to collect some personal items I left in my old bedroom," I stated flatly. She reluctantly stepped aside, allowing me entry. The massive house already felt incredibly different. It felt eerily emptier, significantly colder, even though absolutely none of the expensive furniture had been relocated. I made it exactly halfway up the grand, sweeping staircase before I abruptly stopped, my hand gripping the mahogany banister. I slowly turned around to look down at her. "Why exactly did he do it, Mom?" My mother completely froze in the foyer. "Why what?" she asked, playing incredibly dumb. 32 agonizing years of my life, I yelled, my voice finally cracking under the monumental weight of the rejection. "I desperately need to know exactly why. What horrific crime did I commit as a child to deserve this?" Her facial expression instantly tightened into a mask of pure, unyielding ice. "This is absolutely not the appropriate time for this hysterical conversation, Clara." "Then when exactly is the appropriate time, Mom?" I demanded, taking a step back down the stairs. When will it ever be the correct time to explain my entire life to me? She let out a heavy, exasperated sigh, suddenly appearing incredibly aged and withered. Your father possessed his own highly specific, complex reasons for his actions. You simply need to gracefully accept that reality and move on with your own life. What specific reasons? I begged, tears of pure frustration burning my eyes. I was the one sitting there every single day in that freezing hospital room. I was the one physically holding his hand while he choked on his last breath. Victoria did not even possess the basic decency to cancel her stupid socialite luncheon. Your sister carries massive, critical corporate and social responsibilities that you simply do not possess, my mother snapped, her eyes hardening into black obsidian. They are highly complex, adult matters that you simply do not possess the capacity to understand. Things that are infinitely better left completely alone. So explain them to me right now and let me try to understand, I challenged her. But she was already aggressively turning her back and walking away from me. Collect your pathetic boxes and leave my house, Clara. Some questions absolutely do not possess the answers you are desperately hoping to hear. I stood paralyzed on the stairs and watched her disappear into the massive, gourmet kitchen. Every single primal instinct inside my body aggressively screamed at me to follow her, to physically corner her and violently demand the absolute truth. But I intimately knew that specific, freezing look. That impenetrable brick wall. I had been violently crashing into that exact same wall for my entire existence. Instead of following her, my eyes slowly drifted down the long, dark hallway toward the heavy, closed oak door situated at the very end. My father's private study. The heavy door was pushed slightly ajar. I could clearly see the polished corner of his massive, antique oak desk through the narrow gap. The massive desk. The hidden compartment. My mother was completely occupied in the kitchen. The sprawling house was otherwise completely, utterly silent. I possessed perhaps exactly 10 uninterrupted minutes before she noticed I had not exited the building. It was more than enough time. I silently slipped down the hallway, entered the dark study, and softly clicked the heavy door shut behind me. The room smelled overwhelmingly, sickeningly of him. Expensive leather upholstery, stale imported cigars, and aging paper documents. I had very rarely been permitted to cross the threshold of this room as a child. It was his ultimate, heavily guarded sanctuary, strictly off-limits to absolutely everyone except my mother, and occasionally, the golden child, Victoria. The massive, antique oak desk aggressively dominated the very center of the room. It was an incredibly heavy, ornate piece of furniture passed down directly from my grandfather. I had always thought it was an incredibly beautiful antique. Now, looming in the shadows, it felt deeply ominous and terrifying. I immediately began aggressively searching the most obvious locations. I rapidly pulled open the heavy side drawers. I found stacks of mundane utility bills, complex corporate tax documents, and dozens of framed photographs documenting Victoria at various stages of her glorious achievements. High school graduations, elite award ceremonies, her lavish, six-figure wedding. There was absolutely not a single, solitary photograph of my face anywhere in the entire room. Nothing unusual. Nothing hidden. And then, my eyes locked onto the anomaly. The bottom drawer on the right-hand side was visibly, structurally shallower than all the other drawers. I forcefully pulled it out completely, removing the entire drawer from the desk frame. I ran my trembling fingers aggressively along the interior base. The heavy wooden panels that should have been perfectly flush and smooth were slightly, artificially raised. My heart began to pound so violently against my ribs I thought it might shatter them. I aggressively pressed down hard on the far back corner of the wood. Click. A concealed, spring-loaded false bottom popped upward. I forcefully lifted the heavy wooden panel away with violently shaking hands. Resting inside the dark, hidden cavity was a yellowed, aging envelope, a thick, leather-bound journal that appeared ancient with use, and a significantly larger, heavy manila envelope that had been aggressively sealed with dark red wax. The yellowed, aging envelope instantly captured my complete attention. Written across the front, in my father's unmistakable, precise, architectural handwriting, was a specific date. My exact birth date. The exact day I was violently brought into this world, 32 agonizing years ago. I tore the envelope open and unfolded the brittle, crackling letter tucked inside. The paper was stiff and fragile with age. The very first sentence hit my soul with the physical, devastating force of a speeding freight train. I absolutely never, ever wanted a second daughter. I literally could not pull oxygen into my lungs. I was completely paralyzed, unable to move a single muscle, capable only of continuing to read the horrific words. One single, flawless heir is absolutely enough. One heir is exactly all this prominent family requires to secure its legacy. When Beatrice informed me she was unexpectedly pregnant again, I aggressively demanded she terminate the pregnancy. She stubbornly refused. So I made a firm, irrevocable decision. If this secondary, unwanted child must physically exist in my house, she will absolutely not siphon a single ounce of resources away from Victoria. Absolutely everything, every single lucrative opportunity, every single dollar of my wealth, and every single ounce of familial love belongs exclusively to my firstborn. The second daughter is merely a catastrophic, biological accident. I will provide her with basic, legal tolerance and absolutely nothing more. The brutal, remorseless letter continued for another entire page. I did not stop aggressively reading until I suddenly heard the heavy, muffled sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway outside. I frantically grabbed the letter, the journal, and the sealed manila envelope, shoved them deep inside my jacket, and silently slipped out the secondary patio door before she could discover me. I sat completely alone in my freezing apartment until 3 o'clock in the morning, obsessively reading the documents. The devastating birth letter was merely the prologue to the nightmare. The heavy, leather-bound journal contained 30 entire years of meticulous, handwritten entries detailing my father's sociopathic manipulation. It explicitly told the entire, horrific story of my systemic abuse. Entry from when I was 5 years old, the younger, defective one asked her mother why she is not permitted to enroll in expensive ballet classes exactly like Victoria. I explicitly instructed Beatrice to lie and tell her we simply cannot afford the tuition. She foolishly believed me. Good. Entry from when I was 10 years old, Clara aggressively begged for private piano lessons today. I coldly informed her that only genuinely talented, serious musicians deserve financial investment, and she possesses absolutely zero natural talent. She violently cried in her room. She will eventually get over the disappointment. Entry from when I was 18 years old, she audaciously announced she desires to attend medical school. I explicitly informed her I will only provide minimal financial support if she pursues basic, mundane accounting. Something aggressively practical, located close to home, where I can easily monitor and keep her in line. She submissively agreed to the terms. She always pathetically agrees. Entry from when I was 25 years old, she tentatively mentioned accepting a lucrative corporate transfer to Seattle. I brutally reminded her that if she aggressively abandons this family, she can expect absolutely zero financial inheritance from the estate. She immediately canceled the move and stayed. Every single, massive, life-altering decision I had ever made. Every single time I had violently surrendered a personal dream. Every single time I had intentionally chosen to remain small, compliant, close to home, and obedient, he had sociopathically, meticulously orchestrated the entire outcome. And my mother, the journal explicitly, undeniably made clear, was his willing, active enforcer in the abuse. Beatrice intimately understands her assigned role in this house. She fully comprehends that if she ever displays even a microscopic shred of genuine maternal affection toward the second one, there will be catastrophic financial consequences for her lifestyle. I have made the strict, non-negotiable terms of our marital arrangement exceptionally clear to her. I wanted to violently scream until my vocal cords shredded. I wanted to aggressively hurl the heavy journal through the glass window. I wanted to call my mother's phone and violently demand to know how she could have possibly participated in the destruction of her own child. But there was still the final, heavy manila envelope resting on the table. I forcefully broke the thick, red wax seal. Tucked inside was an incredibly formal, aged legal document that had been meticulously preserved. The bold, black header read, "The Last Will and Testament of Harrison Vance, Sr." It was my grandfather's original, legendary will. The exact document my father had explicitly told the entire family was tragically lost in a fire decades ago. I rapidly read the dense legal text, then aggressively reread it, and suddenly, the entire, devastating universe made perfect, horrifying sense. My grandfather absolutely had not left his massive, generational estate exclusively to my father. The legal document explicitly dictated that his massive wealth was to be divided completely, entirely equally among all of his biological grandchildren. All of them, explicitly including me. My father had maliciously, illegally stolen my massive inheritance before I was even old enough to comprehend the concept of money, and I finally possessed the undeniable, explosive proof. I aggressively dialed Aunt Josephine's phone number at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning. She answered on the very second ring, sounding exactly as if she had been sitting by the phone waiting for the call. "I finally found the evidence," I stated without any preamble or greeting. The original will, his private, meticulous journals, absolutely everything. I heard a long, heavy, shuddering exhale on the other end of the line. I always intrinsically knew that paranoid bastard kept meticulous records. Harrison was always obsessively, pathologically meticulous about documenting his own sociopathic cruelty. We agreed to meet at a nondescript, run-down diner exactly an hour later. Josephine looked incredibly exhausted, but entirely unsurprised, as I aggressively spread the damning documents across the sticky Formica table. "Your grandfather Harrison was a profoundly honorable, deeply fair man," she stated, gently running her fingers over the aged, original will. "He genuinely, equally loved all of his grandchildren. When he knew he was dying, he aggressively ensured his massive estate would be evenly split among them to guarantee their futures. That legally included you, Clara. Even long before you were physically born, he had mandated ironclad legal provisions for any future grandchildren to receive equal shares. But Dad lied and explicitly told everyone in the family that the final will left absolutely everything to him, because he intentionally destroyed the original document and submitted a massive forgery." Josephine's jaw tightened with ancient, suppressed fury. I was highly suspicious of the transaction from the very start. The moment I aggressively confronted him with my suspicions, he violently cut me out of the family entirely. He launched a massive smear campaign, telling the entire extended family I was mentally unstable, pathologically greedy, and actively attempting to steal his rightful wealth. 25 entire years, I whispered, staring at her in shock. "You have known this horrifying truth for 25 years. I strongly suspected it. I simply never possessed the hard, legal proof to destroy him." She firmly tapped the aged document resting in front of me. "But you finally possess the undeniable proof now." I stared intensely at my grandfather's signature. The authentic, original signature, absolutely not whatever crude forgery my father had submitted to the probate court. "What exactly do I do with this explosive information?" I asked. Josephine smoothly pulled out her smartphone. "I know a very specific individual who can assist us. Julian Thorne. He served as your grandfather's primary estate lawyer. He personally drafted this exact document." Harrison aggressively lied and told the entire family Julian had tragically died years ago. She offered a terrifying, grim smile. But Harrison aggressively lied about an incredible multitude of things in his life. "Do you honestly believe this specific lawyer will actually help us now?" "I firmly believe Julian has been sitting in the shadows waiting 25 years for someone to finally uncover this document." She confidently slid a piece of paper with a phone number across the table. "He will absolutely want to hear from you today." For the very first time since this entire nightmare commenced, I felt an emotion other than suffocating, crushing despair. I felt a dangerous, white-hot spark of hope. Julian Thorne's private law office was situated in a decaying, nondescript brick building on the extreme, industrial edge of town. It was the exact type of forgotten place that wealthy people actively pretend does not exist. He personally answered the heavy wooden door. He was a rail-thin man in his late 60s, possessing incredibly kind, intelligent eyes situated behind thick, wire-rimmed glasses. You absolutely must be Clara. He firmly shook my hand with surprising strength. You possess your grandfather's exact, stubborn chin. The three of us, Julian, Josephine, and myself, huddled closely around a chaotic desk completely buried under mountains of legal texts and dusty, archaic case files. I silently handed over the stack of explosive documents. Julian meticulously studied the original, aged will for a very long, agonizing moment. When he finally looked up, his eyes were visibly shining with unshed tears. This is absolutely it. This is the exact, specific will I personally drafted for him. He slowly ran his index finger along the faded margins. I intimately recognized my own shorthand notations. I clearly remember typing every single, specific word of this document. What exactly happened back then? I asked softly. After your grandfather passed away, Julian removed his glasses and aggressively rubbed his tired eyes. Harrison frantically called my office the very day after the burial service. He aggressively claimed he had miraculously discovered a significantly newer will hidden inside your grandfather's private safe, one that completely, legally superseded the document I had drafted. When I rightfully demanded to physically examine this new document, he viciously threatened me. He stated that if I did not immediately back off the inquiry, he would utilize his massive corporate wealth and political connections to have me permanently disbarred and criminally accused of orchestrating massive fraud. And you simply believed his threats? I possessed absolutely zero proof otherwise to defend myself. Julian's voice was thick and heavy with decades of unresolved, toxic guilt. He was your grandfather's biological son. He maintained absolute, tyrannical control over the estate and all the physical documents. What realistically could I have done to stop him? Josephine leaned aggressively forward across the desk. But now we possess the undeniable, explosive proof. Julian nodded his head slowly, the gears turning in his mind. The forensic handwriting experts can easily, definitively confirm this is your grandfather's authentic signature and actively prove the other document is a massive forgery. And the heavy journal. He began rapidly flipping through the pages of the leather book I had provided. Harrison essentially authored a complete, written confession to a litany of massive federal crimes. So, what is our immediate next move? I asked, my heart pounding. Next, Julian met my eyes with fierce intensity. We aggressively challenged the entire fraudulent estate distribution file in probate court. Armed with this mountain of evidence, we possess an incredibly lethal, airtight case. He paused, his expression turning incredibly grave. But Clara, you desperately need to understand exactly what initiating this legal war means. You will be going up in a brutal, highly public war against your own mother, your sister, and your entire extended family structure. I sat there and thought deeply about my 32 agonizing years of total silence. I thought about the crushing pain of being entirely invisible, of passively accepting scraps of affection and desperately trying to label it as love. I fully know exactly what it means, I stated, my voice cold as steel. I am entirely ready for war. Victoria inevitably called me exactly 3 days later. I absolutely knew the confrontation would eventually occur. Toxic rumors travel incredibly fast within aristocratic families like ours. Clara, my sweet sister. Her voice was dripping with artificial, saccharine honey. Honey, I have been hearing some incredibly troubling, bizarre rumors circulating the country club recently. Have you now? I replied smoothly. People are aggressively whispering that you are actively asking deeply inappropriate questions regarding the final will and inquiring into Dad's private affairs. A highly delicate, calculated pause. I completely understand that you are struggling with the grief process, but you absolutely need to let this delusion go immediately. Why exactly should I let it go, Victoria? Because it is incredibly, highly embarrassing for our family's social standing. Dad made his final financial wishes abundantly clear. And did he genuinely make them clear? Did he really? Total, suffocating silence descended upon the line. When she finally spoke again, the artificial sweetness had completely evaporated. I honestly do not know what delusional garbage you think you uncovered, little sister, but I possess extremely powerful, wealthy friends, aggressive corporate lawyers, and individuals who can make your pathetic life incredibly, agonizingly difficult. Is that an official threat you are making on a recorded line? It is simply friendly advice from someone who deeply cares about your well-being. She let out a sharp, tinkling, dismissive laugh, the exact same condescending sound I had been subjected to for my entire life. Come on, Clara. Be realistic. What do you honestly think you are going to accomplish here? Even if there was some microscopic, clerical irregularity, who on earth is going to believe your hysterical claims over my reputation or over Mom's word? I intentionally kept my voice perfectly, terrifyingly steady. I truly appreciate your deep concern for my well-being, Victoria. Just seriously think about the consequences of what you are attempting to do. That is all I ask. She aggressively disconnected the call. I sat entirely still, the phone gripped tightly in my hand, my heart racing with adrenaline. She was absolutely terrified. I could clearly hear the raw panic bleeding beneath her arrogant threats. Victoria Vance Collins, the ultimate, untouchable golden child extraordinaire, was actually terrified of me. 10 minutes later, my phone violently buzzed again. Mom. Clara. Her voice was incredibly small, shaky, and stripped of all its usual bravado. I desperately need to see you in person. There is something vital I urgently need to confess to you. About what exactly? A long, agonizing pause, followed by a barely audible whisper. About the secret letter. About the horrific things your father forced me to participate in. I aggressively gripped the edge of my desk. Whatever reaction I had anticipated from her, it was absolutely not this. When and where are we meeting? Tomorrow morning, at the small cafe on 5th Street. Please, come completely alone. She hung up the phone before I could offer a response. My hands were visibly trembling. My mother desperately wanted to talk after 32 grueling years of complicit silence. Something fundamental in the universe had shifted, and I was entirely unsure if that was a positive development or something utterly terrifying. The small, independent cafe was nearly deserted when I arrived. My mother was seated silently in a dim, corner booth, looking significantly smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her in my entire life. She wore absolutely zero makeup, no expensive jewelry, just a worn, oversized cardigan, and she kept both her hands wrapped tightly around a cold, untouched cup of coffee. I slowly slid into the vinyl seat directly across from her. You actually came, she whispered, not meeting my eyes. You specifically asked me to. For a very long, heavy moment, neither of us uttered a single syllable. Then, my mother's thin shoulders began to violently shake. I intimately know about the existence of the hidden letter, Clara. I have always known exactly what it said. My throat instantly tightened, cutting off my air supply. Then why on earth did you allow it to happen? Because I was an absolute, pathetic coward. Massive, hot tears spilled rapidly down her cheeks, carving messy, wet tracks through the pale foundation she hadn't bothered to properly apply. When I initially married your wealthy father, I possessed absolutely nothing to my name. Zero capital, no supportive family, zero alternative options. He generously gave me absolutely everything, and he aggressively ensured I knew every single day that he possessed the terrifying power to take it all away in an instant. So you actively, willingly went along with it. With treating your own child like I fundamentally did not matter. He explicitly said. She choked violently on a deep sob. He aggressively told me that if I ever displayed too much maternal affection toward you, he would immediately divorce me. He swore he would leave me utterly destitute on the freezing streets. He threatened to tell everyone in our social circle that I was mentally unstable and crazy, exactly what he did to Josephine. I sat there and thought about all those agonizing years. The freezing, dismissive looks. The cruel, cutting comments. The agonizing way she would physically flinch and pull away whenever I desperately reached out for her hand as a child. Did you ever, for a single microsecond, actually love me? The massive, devastating question hung suspended in the stale air between us. Every single day, my mother finally lifted her head and met my eyes. Every single, agonizing day, Clara. I was entirely too terrified of him to ever show it. I desperately wanted to stand up and scream at her. I wanted to violently rage about the protective mother she was biologically obligated to have been. But sitting there, looking at this pathetic, broken, Shattered woman who had maliciously sacrificed the soul of her own daughter simply to ensure her own financial survival. All I felt was an overwhelming, crushing sense of exhausted sadness. Did you explicitly know about grandfather's original will? She frantically shook her head. Harrison absolutely never, ever discussed the intricate details of the finances with me. I just blindly, obediently did exactly what I was instructed to do. My phone suddenly buzzed on the table. It was an urgent text message from my colleague Julian at the firm. Check your social media feeds right now. I immediately opened the application, and the blood instantly ran freezing cold in my veins. Victoria had aggressively posted a massive, public statement in the extended family group chat. It was a lengthy, highly curated message intentionally painting me as mentally unstable, pathologically greedy, and aggressively attempting to steal from my grieving, vulnerable relatives. The all-out, public war had officially, undeniably begun. Let me pause the narrative right here for a brief second. If you are sitting there watching this video, and you have ever intimately felt exactly like the invisible, forgotten ghost in your own family, like absolutely no matter how hard you tried, or what massive sacrifices you made, it was never, ever deemed good enough. I truly, deeply see you. I really do. Please drop a comment below and let me know. Have you ever been violently forced to stand up and fight against the exact people who were biologically supposed to love you unconditionally? What specific event finally gave you the iron courage to do it? And if you are deeply feeling the story of survival, please hit that subscribe button right now. We are just getting to the explosive part where the entire universe starts to violently change. Now, let us dive back into exactly what happened next. Within a mere 24 hours, my cellular phone transformed into an active, hostile battlefield. I received an avalanche of aggressive text messages from distant relatives I had not spoken a word to in years. Every single message was infinitely more cutting and cruel than the last. Aunt Beatrice, Clara, I heard the horrific rumors about what you are currently attempting to do. How could you possibly be so cruel? Your poor father just passed away. Cousin David, this behavior is incredibly low, even for someone like you. Attempting to maliciously steal from your own grieving mother. Uncle Arthur, your father possessed highly specific, valid reasons for what he executed in his will. You should respectfully honor the wishes of the dead. I slowly scrolled through Victoria's toxic, public post again. She had meticulously, brilliantly crafted it. She played the role of the deeply concerned, loving older sister, terribly worried about her deeply troubled, unstable sibling who was aggressively lashing out in her grief. The comment section was rapidly overflowing with cloying support for her. I am so incredibly sorry you are being forced to deal with this nightmare. Vic, family drama over money is the absolute worst. Stay incredibly strong. Some deeply insecure people just absolutely cannot handle the reality of not being the favorite child. That final, venomous comment stung my soul significantly more than I wanted to admit. My trusted friend Julian found me sitting quietly at my desk the very next morning, blankly staring at the glowing screen. "Hey," he said softly, pulling up a chair beside me. "Are you holding up okay?" I let out a dark, bitter laugh. My entire extended family is currently convinced I am either completely crazy, pathologically greedy, or a terrifying combination of both. Julian leaned in incredibly close. "You know exactly what I think about this situation? Genuinely innocent people do not desperately need to orchestrate massive, public smear campaigns. If Victoria truly had absolutely nothing to hide from the world, she would absolutely not be working this incredibly hard to make you look like a monster." He possessed a brilliant, undeniable point. That exact same evening, a heavy, certified legal letter arrived at my apartment by a courier. It was from a highly aggressive, prestigious corporate law firm I did not immediately recognize. "Dear Ms. Vance, our client, Victoria Vance Collins, has officially retained our aggressive legal services regarding your recent, highly defamatory public statements concerning the distribution of the Vance family estate. We hereby forcefully demand that you immediately cease and desist all legal claims, both public or private, regarding the final distribution of Harrison Vance's assets. Failure to strictly comply with this mandate will immediately result in aggressive legal action against you for severe defamation and the intentional infliction of severe emotional distress. They were aggressively attempting to financially and legally terrify me into submission. I calmly set the threatening letter down on my kitchen counter and immediately picked up my phone. Julian, it is Clara. We desperately need to move the timeline forward significantly faster. Dr. Evelyn Thorne was universally recognized as one of the most highly respected, ruthless forensic document examiners in the entire state. Julian aggressively called in several massive corporate favors just to secure a spot on her tightly booked schedule within the week. Her private laboratory was incredibly clinical. Stark white walls, blindingly bright overhead lights, and a massive steel desk completely covered with highly advanced magnifying and digital scanning equipment. She meticulously spread out the explosive documents we had provided. My grandfather's authentic, original will, the blatant, crude forgery that my father had illegally filed with the municipal probate court, and several dozen authenticated samples of both men's historical handwriting. Give me exactly 1 hour to analyze the data, she stated clinically. It was undeniably the longest, most agonizing hour of my entire life. Josephine aggressively paced the length of the narrow hallway. Julian sat incredibly rigid in the waiting room chair. I stared blankly down at my trembling hands and desperately tried not to hope too fiercely for a miracle. When Dr. Thorne finally emerged from the laboratory, her facial expression was entirely, terrifyingly unreadable. The original will, she began, carefully holding up my grandfather's ancient document with gloved hands. This specific signature is absolutely, undeniably genuine. The micropressure patterns, the specific letter formations, and the natural, biological variations are 100% consistent with your provided reference samples of Harrison Vance Sr.'s historical handwriting. My heart completely stuttered in my chest. And the other document? Julian asked, leaning forward. Dr. Thorne's sharp eyes hardened into steel. The signature located on the officially filed will show massive, undeniable, clinical indicators of severe forgery. Significant hesitation marks, a highly inconsistent baseline pressure, and completely unnatural pen lifts. Someone aggressively, meticulously attempted to trace this signature, but they were absolutely not careful enough. Are you completely, legally certain? I asked, barely daring to breathe. I would confidently stake my entire, unblemished professional reputation on these findings in any federal courtroom. She handed me a thick, sealed envelope. This is my highly official, sworn report, complete with the forensic documentation. This evidence will absolutely, undeniably hold up in front of a judge. Julian exhaled a long, shuddering breath. We officially possess enough firepower to file the lawsuit. The overwhelming relief nearly knocked me physically sideways. Undeniable proof. Actual, documented, forensic proof that my father had aggressively lied, committed felony forgery, and systematically stolen my future. But Dr. Thorne was absolutely not finished. There is actually something significantly more explosive. Your father's leather journal. She pointed directly to a highly specific, highlighted entry. He explicitly refers to his wife fully knowing about the illegal arrangement and aggressively maintaining her silence. That serves as massive, undeniable legal corroboration. Victoria, Josephine stated suddenly, her voice cutting through the room. If Beatrice knew the truth, Victoria highly likely knew the truth as well. I immediately thought of my older sister's frantic threats over the phone. Her underlying, raw panic. What exactly else was she desperately attempting to hide from the world? I possessed exactly one highly explosive method to find out. One aggressive, final move that would violently force absolutely everything out into the open daylight. Julian, I stated firmly, my voice cold as ice. I want to aggressively call a mandatory, full family meeting. The agonizing night prior to the mandated family meeting, I sat completely alone in my freezing apartment with every single light turned off. My father's heavy leather journal rested open on my lap. I had obsessively read the damning entries so many hundreds of times that the pages were physically wearing thin. But tonight, I desperately needed to absorb the venom one final time. Entry from when I was 10 years old, the younger, Defective girl aggressively asked why Victoria receives a significantly larger, more expensive Christmas haul than she does. I coldly informed her that Santa inherently knows exactly who deserves more in this life. She violently cried herself to sleep. Beatrice weakly asked if we could perhaps purchase her something small, something extra. I brutally reminded Beatrice of the strict terms of our arrangement. Entry from when I was 16 years old, Clara proudly brought home a prestigious scholarship application today. She desperately wants to apply for an elite art program located entirely across the country. I violently threw the application directly into the trash incinerator and coldly informed her that she absolutely was not talented enough to succeed. She pathetically apologized to me for wasting my valuable time. Entry from when I was 20 years old, she is currently dating someone. A boy who aggressively wants to take her to California with him. I brutally reminded her that if she chooses to leave the state, she is entirely, permanently on her own. Zero financial safety net, zero family connection. She abruptly ended the relationship the very next week. I slowly, deliberately closed the heavy journal and finally allowed myself to violently cry. It was not the quiet, suppressed tears I usually shed. These were massive, great, heaving sobs that violently shook my entire physical body. 32 agonizing years of psychological manipulation. Every single, beautiful dream I had been violently forced to abandon. Every single agonizing choice I had made to ensure I remained small, stayed close to my abusers, and stayed perfectly obedient. Absolutely none of it occurred because I was inherently not good enough. It occurred because I was maliciously, systematically never allowed to be good enough. When the violent tears finally ceased, I felt an entirely new emotion taking root. It was not burning anger. It was not suffocating grief. It was absolute, unshakable, titanium resolve. Tomorrow, I would finally, aggressively face my toxic family. Not armed with petty vengeance, but armed with the undeniable, explosive truth. They could actively choose to accept reality or violently reject it. But I would absolutely no longer remain their silent, invisible victim. I picked up my phone and dispatched one final, decisive email. The meeting is officially confirmed. Sunday at 2 p.m. At Mom's primary residence. I will absolutely be there. Then I powered down my phone, lay down in the darkness, and slept infinitely more peacefully than I had in weeks. The ultimate, destructive storm was rapidly approaching, and I was finally, entirely ready to face it. My mother's sprawling house felt incredibly, suffocatingly smaller than I remembered it being. The massive living room was uncomfortably packed to absolute capacity. My mother sat rigidly on the main, pristine white sofa, looking incredibly frail, terrified, and deeply uncertain. Victoria sat directly beside her, her legs elegantly crossed, her facial expression radiating a cool, arrogant hostility. Her husband, Richard, stood awkwardly near the massive bay window, his arms tightly folded, adamantly refusing to make eye contact with a single person in the room. And strategically scattered around the sprawling room were various aunts, uncles, and specific cousins, individuals Victoria had aggressively, specifically invited to serve as her supportive audience, eager witnesses to what she undoubtedly expected to be my ultimate, humiliating public breakdown. Well, Victoria's sharp, condescending voice violently cut through the low, ambient murmuring. We are all officially gathered here. What exactly is so incredibly important that you aggressively dragged everyone out of their homes on a Sunday afternoon? I stood confidently near the massive stone fireplace, my heavy leather bag resting securely at my feet. Thank you all for taking the time to come today. I intentionally maintained my vocal tone at a terrifyingly steady, professional pitch. I am well aware that Victoria has aggressively circulated her highly fabricated version of what is currently transpiring. I am standing here today to present you with the absolute, unvarnished truth. Aunt Beatrice loudly, derisively scoffed from the corner. We are already perfectly aware of the truth. You are maliciously attempting to steal your grieving sister's rightful inheritance. No, I replied smoothly. I am aggressively attempting to legally reclaim exactly what was maliciously stolen from me decades ago. The crowded room immediately stirred with discomfort. I witnessed rapid, Nervous glances being exchanged, highly skeptical, deeply uncomfortable, and intensely curious. This entire situation is absolutely not about the money, I continued, my voice gaining volume. It is entirely about our late father. It is about exposing exactly who he truly, monstrously was. It is about horrific, illegal decisions he made 32 years ago that absolutely none of you possess any knowledge of. Victoria let out a high, sharp, incredibly artificial laugh. This is absolutely pathetic, Clara. You are deeply, profoundly embarrassing yourself in front of the entire family. Am I genuinely embarrassing myself? I asked softly. I slowly reached into my heavy leather bag and pulled out the yellowed, brittle envelope. I discovered this specific document hidden inside Dad's private, locked desk. It is a letter he meticulously wrote on the exact day of my birth. The massive living room went completely, terrifyingly still. Would you all like to hear exactly what it says? Victoria's smug smile violently faltered. My mother's trembling hand instantly flew up to cover her throat. I carefully unfolded the fragile letter, my hands incredibly steady, and began to read aloud. I absolutely never, ever wanted a second daughter. Total, suffocating, absolute silence gripped the room. I ruthlessly kept reading, and with every single devastating word, I watched the collective expression of the room violently morph from arrogant skepticism to absolute, unadulterated shock. Absolutely no one was laughing now. I read the most damning, horrific key passages directly from the letter. Then I aggressively opened the heavy leather journal. This book contains 30 entire years of meticulous, daily entries. All of them are written in Dad's verified, undeniable handwriting. I held the massive book high into the air for the entire room to witness. 30 years of aggressively, clinically documenting exactly how he planned to maliciously cut me entirely out of this family structure. Victoria abruptly stood up from the sofa. This does not legally prove a single thing. Absolutely anyone could have easily fabricated that. Garbage. A highly respected, certified forensic handwriting expert has fully, legally verified every single document I hold in my hands. I aggressively slammed the thick forensic report down onto the glass coffee table. Would anyone in this room like to examine her certified, explosive findings? Absolutely no one moved a single muscle. But that is actually not the most devastating, important piece of evidence I uncovered. I slowly pulled out the heavy manila envelope, the specific one that had remained securely sealed for decades. This specific document is our grandfather's actual legal will. The genuine, original document. The exact one that Dad aggressively, repeatedly told everyone was tragically lost in a fire. Uncle Arthur leaned aggressively forward in his chair. What exactly do you mean by the real one? I mean that our grandfather legally, explicitly left his massive estate to be divided completely, equally among all of his biological grandchildren. All of us. I slowly swept my gaze around the massive, shocked room. Not exclusively just Victoria. Every single one of us. Shocked, chaotic murmurs violently rippled through the dense crowd. Aunt Beatrice's jaw literally dropped open. Dad maliciously forged an entirely new will. He aggressively, illegally hid the authentic original document. He successfully, systematically stole millions of dollars in inheritance from almost every single person sitting in this room. I aggressively flipped the heavy journal open to a highly specific, dog-eared page. And he explicitly, proudly wrote about his massive crimes right here in his own words. The original, problematic will has been successfully destroyed. Absolutely no one will ever uncover the truth. Victoria's face had drained of all blood, turning a sickly, stark white. You are completely, pathologically lying. Am I truly lying? I asked, meeting her terrified eyes with unyielding ice. Then please, explain this document to the room. I aggressively pulled out the final piece of evidence, a thick printout of an archived email chain. This is explicit, highly detailed digital correspondence between Dad and you, Victoria. It is dated from exactly 5 years ago. It is an email chain where he explicitly explains the entire, horrific illegal operation to you and aggressively demands that you keep the massive secret. Richard, Victoria's husband, abruptly straightened his posture from his spot by the bay window. What on earth did you just say? Your beloved wife has intimately known the absolute truth of this massive fraud for 5 entire years. I forcefully handed him the printed email chain. She actively, knowingly chose to say absolutely nothing and keep the stolen millions. The entire living room violently erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. Richard was staring at Victoria in absolute, unmasked horror, the printed email chain crushed tightly in his shaking fist. You explicitly knew about this massive crime this entire time. You intimately knew, and you absolutely said nothing to me. I absolutely didn't. It wasn't. Victoria desperately reached out for him, her voice cracking with pure panic. Richard, please, you have to let me explain the context. Explain exactly what to me, Victoria? Explain that you coldly allowed your own sister to be treated like complete, disposable garbage for decades while you aggressively hoarded absolutely everything for yourself? It was absolutely not my fault at all. Dad aggressively made me swear a blood promise. And in your diseased mind, that somehow makes your complicity perfectly acceptable. Across the sprawling room, Aunt Beatrice had aggressively cornered my weeping mother. Beatrice, is this horrifying information actually true? Did Harrison really orchestrate all of this evil? My mother was completely incapable of answering. She simply continued to violently sob, frantically shaking her head, suddenly appearing 20 years older than she had just a single hour ago. Cousin David was aggressively reading the damning journal entries over Uncle Arthur's shoulder. I clearly heard him mutter, "Holy Jesus Christ," under his breath. Everywhere I looked, there were frantic, whispered conversations, shocked glances directed at me, some deeply apologetic, some utterly stunned, and some still struggling with severe disbelief. Then, Aunt Beatrice slowly approached me. The exact same woman who had sent me that incredibly cruel, cutting text message just a few short days ago. Clara, her voice was incredibly rough, thick with emotion. I honestly had absolutely no idea. None of us possessed a single clue. I completely understand, I replied softly. No, you absolutely do not understand. She aggressively gripped my hand with surprising strength. I am so profoundly sorry. We absolutely all should have seen through the facade. We should have asked the hard questions decades ago. I simply nodded. That was the absolute only response I could manage to muster. Behind her, Victoria was still frantically, pathetically pleading with Richard. He was absolutely no longer listening to a single word she said. I briefly caught my mother's terrified eye across the chaotic room. She looked at me with an incredibly complex expression I could not quite decode. Deep shame, profound sorrow, and a desperate plea for something I was absolutely certain I could not give her. I slowly turned my back and confidently walked out the front door. Josephine was already waiting patiently by my parked car. "Are you holding up okay?" she asked softly. I took a massive, deep breath. The crisp autumn air was incredibly clean and sharp, absolutely nothing like the toxic, suffocating atmosphere I had just successfully escaped. Yeah, I said, realizing the profound truth of my own words. For the very first time in my entire 32 years of existence, I genuinely think I actually am. I was just moments away from unlocking my car door when I heard the heavy front door violently swing open behind me. "Clara, please, wait." It was my mother's voice, incredibly small, fractured, and broken. I stopped my movement, but absolutely did not turn around to face her. I heard her hesitant, slow footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. "Please, I am begging you, just grant me one single moment." I slowly turned around. She looked exactly like a hollowed-out ghost of herself. Her expensive mascara was violently smeared across her cheeks, her hands were trembling uncontrollably, and the flawless, perfect widow's facade had been completely, utterly shattered into dust. Can you ever possibly find it in your heart to forgive me? The massive, devastating question hung suspended in the freezing air between us. 32 agonizing years. All those lonely birthdays spent desperately wondering exactly why I was never deemed good enough. All those agonizing nights violently crying in my dark bedroom while Victoria received absolutely everything I had ever desperately wanted. All those countless times I had innocently reached out for my mother's comforting hand, and she had coldly, abruptly pulled away. "Mom." My voice emerged from my throat sounding infinitely steadier than I expected. For 32 entire years, absolutely all I ever desperately wanted was for you to simply love me. I worked so incredibly hard. I did absolutely everything perfectly right. I aggressively tried to be the flawless, perfect daughter, and the entire agonizing time, you fully knew. You explicitly knew exactly the horrific abuse he was inflicting upon me, and you actively chose to protect him over me. She violently sobbed, her shoulders heaving. I was so incredibly terrified of him. I was your biological daughter. I was incredibly terrified of him too. I was just a defenseless child, Mom. I desperately needed you to protect me. She possessed absolutely zero defense or answer for that truth. I honestly do not know if I possess the capacity to ever forgive you, I stated coldly. Perhaps someday in the distant future. But right now, what I absolutely know for certain is this. I absolutely do not require your approval anymore. I do not require Dad's toxic approval anymore. I spent my entire existence desperately trying to earn something that was absolutely never, ever being offered to me in the first place. I took a deep, cleansing breath. I was inherently always worthy of being loved. I just tragically happened to be born into a broken family that lacked the capacity to give it. My mother's knees completely gave out beneath her. She sank heavily onto the cold concrete porch steps, violently crying entirely too hard to utter another word. I turned and confidently walked back to my vehicle. Josephine immediately opened the passenger door for me. You did incredibly, profoundly good today, she stated quietly. I know, I replied, smoothly sliding into the driver's seat. For the very first time in my life, I actually know that I did. We drove away from the sprawling estate, and I absolutely did not look in the rearview mirror once. Exactly 2 weeks following the explosive family meeting, Julian officially filed the massive civil lawsuit. The local news media aggressively picked up the sensational story. Prominent local family faces massive estate fraud allegations. There was a large, glossy photograph of my father from some elite charity gala attached to the article, smiling that distinguished, arrogant smile I had grown up utterly fearing. Victoria frantically hired a massive team of incredibly expensive corporate lawyers, the exact kind of ruthless legal sharks who bill significantly more per hour than I typically earn in an entire week. They aggressively dispatched threatening demand letters, arrogantly demanded we immediately withdraw the lawsuit, and loudly promised to completely bury us in endless legal motions and aggressive counterclaims. Julian was absolutely not intimidated in the slightest. Let them aggressively posture all they want, he casually stated during our initial, intensive strategy meeting. The forensic evidence is absolutely overwhelming and irrefutable. We possess the authentic original will, verified forensic signatures, and Harrison's very own extensive journal explicitly confessing to every single crime. Absolutely no amount of expensive legal maneuvering can magically make that mountain of evidence disappear. The initial legal discovery phase was absolutely brutal and exhausting. Endless depositions, aggressive document requests, grueling hours spent trapped in stuffy conference rooms while hostile lawyers aggressively asked the exact same questions 50 different ways to try and trip me up. Victoria was legally forced to testify first. I silently watched through a secure video feed as she aggressively, arrogantly denied absolutely everything, her voice noticeably cracking under the immense legal pressure. But the exact moment they abruptly produced the printed email, the undeniable digital proof proving she had intimately known about the fraud for 5 entire years, she completely, utterly broke down on the stand. I was merely trying to protect my family's legacy, she sobbed hysterically into the microphone. I honestly did not fully comprehend that it was highly illegal. Josephine tightly squeezed my hand under the table. She is absolutely, pathologically lying. She knew exactly the magnitude of what she was executing. Perhaps she was lying. Or perhaps Victoria had spent so many decades comfortably living deep inside my father's toxic shadow that she legitimately could no longer differentiate between family protection and malicious, criminal complicity. The devastating news rapidly spread like wildfire through our elite social circles. Old, prominent friends of my parents completely, abruptly stopped communicating with us. The family's highly coveted, exclusive country club membership was quietly, permanently revoked. The Vance family name, which was once heavily synonymous with massive success and ironclad respectability, rapidly devolved into a toxic scandal that people eagerly whispered about at high-end dinner parties. And then, early one morning, I received an entirely unexpected, highly cryptic email from Richard Collins. Subject line: "We urgently need to have a conversation." The body of the message was incredibly brief. "I currently possess something highly explosive that you desperately need to see in person. Meet me at noon." Richard, Victoria's estranged husband, actively wanted to speak with me completely alone. Richard looked exactly like a man who had not managed to sleep a single wink in weeks. We quietly met at a tiny, obscure coffee shop situated entirely across town, a location where absolutely neither of our families would ever think to look for us. "Thank you so much for agreeing to come," he stated, awkwardly sliding into the vinyl booth directly across from me. "Your email was incredibly cryptic and alarming. I am perfectly aware. He aggressively ran a shaking hand through his deeply disheveled hair. "Ever since the explosive revelations at that family meeting, I have been obsessively replaying our entire history in my mind. 10 entire years of marriage. All the horrific, cruel things Victoria constantly said about you. All the countless times I blindly, foolishly believed her lies. I remained perfectly silent and waited for him to continue. She constantly told me you were deeply jealous, mentally unstable, that you had always been an incredibly difficult, dramatic burden, and that your parents had done their absolute, saintly best to manage you. I never once questioned her narrative." His laugh was incredibly bitter and hollow. "I absolutely never questioned a single thing in our entire marriage. What exactly changed your mind now?" Richard slowly reached into his expensive jacket pocket and pulled out a tiny, silver USB flash drive. "After you dramatically left the house that day, I began aggressively searching for answers. Victoria possesses a highly secure, password-protected hidden folder on her personal laptop, but she foolishly utilized the date of our wedding anniversary as the password." He let out another sharp, bitter laugh. "Hidden inside that folder were years upon years of highly detailed, extensive email correspondence between her and your late father. And this drive?" I gently slid the silver drive back across the table. "What exactly is on it?" "It is undeniable, digital proof that Victoria did not merely know about the forged will. She actively, aggressively helped him orchestrate the massive cover-up. There are highly detailed documents, massive offshore bank transfers, and extensive coordination with shady lawyers to aggressively suppress any potential inquiries." Richard's voice cracked with deep emotion. "She was absolutely not just an innocent bystander in this nightmare, Clara. She was a fully complicit, active partner in the massive fraud." I stared intensely at the tiny flash drive. Such an incredibly small, insignificant-looking object holding such absolutely enormous, life-destroying implications. "Why on earth are you voluntarily handing this over to me?" Richard finally met my eyes, his expression utterly defeated. "Because I formally filed for a divorce early this morning. And because I blindly spent 10 entire years married to a sociopath who comfortably watched her own sister suffer in agony and did absolutely nothing to intervene. I obviously cannot change what I was too blind to see in the past, but I can aggressively assist you right now." He stood up to leave the booth, then paused for a moment. "For whatever it is truly worth to your soul, I am so profoundly sorry. For absolutely all of it." He turned and walked out of the shop. I sat completely alone in that booth for a very long time, endlessly turning the tiny flash drive over and over in my trembling hands. It was the ultimate, final nail in their coffin, and I hadn't even been required to swing the hammer myself. "Okay, I need to pause the narrative right here for a brief moment. When Richard unexpectedly handed me that explosive flash drive, I genuinely, honestly did not know exactly what emotion to feel. Deep vindication, overwhelming sadness, or profound relief. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone completely shocked you by doing the absolute right thing when you least expected it? Someone you had entirely written off who suddenly turned around and bravely stood up when it truly mattered the most? Please let me know your stories in the comments section. And if you are still deeply invested in this journey with me, thank you. We are rapidly approaching the ultimate conclusion. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. You absolutely will not want to miss exactly how this entire nightmare wraps up. Victoria frantically called my phone exactly 3 days later. There was absolutely no artificial, saccharine honey in her voice this time. It was just raw, unadulterated desperation. We urgently need to speak face to face. Please, Clara, I am desperately begging you. Just grant me 10 minutes of your time. We agreed to meet at a quiet, public park located near her new, significantly downsized apartment. Since Richard had aggressively kept the primary estate in the divorce filings, she had been forced to relocate. She was sitting completely alone on a wooden bench when I arrived, and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Absolutely no high-end designer clothes. No flawless, professional makeup. Just a deeply wrinkled, oversized sweater and massive, dark, bruising circles under her eyes. Richard officially left me, she stated, her voice completely flat and devoid of life. He aggressively took absolutely everything he possibly could in the proceedings. The digital evidence, the hidden files, absolutely all of it. I slowly sat down on the far end of the bench, deliberately leaving a significant amount of physical space between us. I am already aware of that fact. She violently flinched. So, I suppose that is it then. You have successfully won the war. You finally secured absolutely everything you ever wanted in life. This entire ordeal was absolutely never about winning a competition, Victoria. Then what exactly is it about? She finally turned her head to look directly at me, and I saw genuine tears rapidly building in her eyes. What exactly do you desperately want from me? I will gladly give you the money. Half of absolutely everything. Significantly more than half. Just please, I am begging you, drop the massive lawsuit. Let this horrific nightmare finally end. You genuinely, truly think this entire situation is exclusively about money, don't you? I let out a soft laugh. It was not a cruel laugh, just incredibly, profoundly sad. No, Victoria. It was absolutely never about the money. Then what on earth do you want from me? I desperately want you to finally admit the absolute truth. I turned my body to face her completely. Look me directly in the eye and tell me the unvarnished truth. You explicitly knew exactly what Dad was doing to me. You knew the truth for years. And you absolutely never said a single word to stop him. Victoria's face completely crumpled in agony. For a very long, agonizing moment, she remained completely silent. Then, in a voice that was barely audible above a rough whisper, I intimately knew the truth. I knew absolutely everything. And I was simply too incredibly selfish to care. The massive, devastating confession hung heavily in the air between us. Why exactly did you do it? I asked. I am your biological sister. She desperately wiped her flowing eyes with the back of her trembling hand. Because I was utterly terrified that if I ever dared to speak up, I would inevitably end up exactly like you. The invisible, discarded one. The child that absolutely nobody wanted to protect. I sat in silence and let the horrific weight of that statement fully sink in. Then I slowly stood up. When you were finally, truly ready to take absolute, genuine responsibility for your actions, really, truly take it, you know exactly where to find me. Until then, the answer is absolutely no. I confidently walked away and did not look back a single time. The massive courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Sensational word had rapidly spread through the city about the epic Vance family financial scandal, and absolutely everyone desperately wanted to witness exactly how the drama concluded. Aggressive local reporters heavily lined the back rows of the gallery. Former, affluent friends of my parents sat strategically scattered throughout the room, pathetically pretending they were not simply there to morbidly gawk at the destruction. I sat confidently beside Julian, with Josephine seated firmly on my other side as my anchor. Across the wide center aisle, Victoria sat deeply hunched between her expensive defense lawyers, looking infinitely smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her in my life. My mother completely failed to attend the proceedings. I was honestly not surprised in the slightest. The legal proceedings moved significantly faster than I had ever anticipated. Julian aggressively and systematically presented our mountain of irrefutable evidence. The original, authentic will. Dr. Thorne's explosive expert forensic analysis. The damning journal entries. The devastating email chains. Every single piece of evidence structurally built upon the last, until the final, comprehensive picture was absolutely undeniable. Victoria's defense lawyers desperately attempted to object. They desperately tried to introduce microscopic elements of reasonable doubt. But there was simply an overwhelming, suffocating amount of hard proof, and absolutely everyone in the room explicitly knew it. The ultimate, devastating turning point occurred when Richard was formally called to take the witness stand. He testified incredibly calmly and with total, professional detachment. Yes, his ex-wife had intimately known about the forged legal will. Yes, she had actively, maliciously helped to conceal the massive crime. Yes, he possessed the explosive digital evidence, the emails, the hidden documents, the offshore bank transfers. When he finally concluded his testimony, you literally could have heard a pin drop on the carpet in the silent courtroom. The presiding judge formally called a brief recess to review the new evidence. I stepped out into the busy hallway to get some fresh air and unexpectedly found myself standing face to face with Aunt Beatrice. "I just desperately want you to know," she stated incredibly quietly, refusing to break eye contact. "I completely believe your story now. I think the vast majority of the family finally does." Before I could formulate a response, the armed bailiff called us back inside the courtroom. The judge did not force us to wait long for a decision. He had meticulously reviewed the massive mountain of evidence, consulted with the forensic experts, and carefully considered all legal arguments presented. "It is the official, final ruling of this court," he stated, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "that the specific document officially filed as Harrison Vance's last will and testament was illegally obtained through massive fraud and malicious misrepresentation. The original, authentic will of Harrison Vance Sr. is hereby legally reinstated in full. The entire, massive estate will be immediately redistributed strictly according to its authentic, original terms." Profound, overwhelming relief violently crashed over my body like a massive tidal wave. It was finally, officially over. After absolutely everything, the endless lies, the psychological manipulation, the decades of being entirely invisible, it was finally, permanently over. Julian firmly shook my hand. Josephine fiercely embraced me. And across the sprawling room, Victoria sat completely motionless, staring blankly at absolutely nothing. I eventually found my mother sitting alone on a cold concrete bench located just outside the courthouse steps. She had completely failed to enter the building, but she had apparently been sitting out there the entire agonizing time, just waiting for the verdict. I slowly sat down beside her without waiting to be invited. "It is completely over," I stated simply. "I heard the news." Her voice was incredibly weak, barely audible. I quietly listened to the proceedings from the hallway. We sat in total, heavy silence for a very long time. Hundreds of people quickly passed by us, their mundane conversations swirling around us like chaotic water flowing around stones in a river. "I absolutely do not expect you to ever forgive me," my mother finally said, staring at the concrete. "I explicitly know that I absolutely do not deserve your forgiveness." "What exactly do you want from me then?" She slowly turned her head to look directly at me. She really, truly looked at me, perhaps for the very first time in decades. "I desperately want you to know that I genuinely loved you every single day of my life, even when I absolutely could not find the courage to show it to you." Her trembling hand slowly reached out toward mine. "I know that statement absolutely does not fix a single thing. I know I catastrophically failed you in absolutely every single conceivable way a mother can fail her child. Then why on earth did you never try to protect me?" "Because I was incredibly weak." The devastating word tumbled out of her mouth like a physical confession. Harrison aggressively controlled absolutely everything. The massive finances, the sprawling house, our entire social standing in the community. When he violently threatened to leave me with absolutely nothing, I foolishly, terrifiedly believed him. I was so incredibly paralyzed by the fear of being left alone that I maliciously sacrificed the soul of my own daughter. Massive tears streamed continuously down her aged face. I am absolutely not sitting here asking for your complete forgiveness, Clara. I am simply asking, is there absolutely any microscopic chance? Any chance at all that we could attempt to slowly start over? I sat there and thought deeply about the magnitude of her question. Really, truly analyzed it in my soul. Could I possibly forgive her horrific betrayal? Could I ever trust her again? Could we successfully build something authentic and real from the burning ashes of 32 years of toxic lies? I possessed absolutely no concrete answers, but I knew one undeniable truth. I absolutely cannot promise you a single thing, I stated slowly and carefully. But I am genuinely willing to try, if you are genuinely willing to do the hard work. My mother's trembling hand firmly closed over mine. It was incredibly warm, shockingly real. It was the very first genuine, unforced physical touch we had shared in longer than I could possibly remember. I am fully committed to trying, she whispered through her tears. I swear to you I am. It was absolutely not a flawless resolution. It was absolutely not instant, magical healing. But it was undeniably a start. Exactly 3 months following the explosive court verdict, I unexpectedly heard from Victoria again. It was not routed through expensive, aggressive lawyers this time. It was just a simple, highly direct text message. Can we please meet? She had officially relocated to a tiny, incredibly modest apartment on the absolute far edge of town. Completely gone were the high-end designer furnishings, the sprawling, expensive art collection, and all the visible evidence of her previously privileged, untouchable life. What remained in the space was incredibly sparse and highly practical. A basic couch, a simple table, and dozens of cardboard boxes she had not even bothered to unpack yet. She slowly opened the door, looking exactly like an entirely different human being. She was drastically thinner, incredibly quiet, and there was a haunted something deep in her eyes that had absolutely never existed there before. I was honestly completely unsure if you would actually show up, she stated softly. Neither was I replied honestly. We sat awkwardly across from each other at her tiny, cheap kitchen table. She cautiously offered me coffee. I politely accepted. The massive divorce is completely, legally finalized, she stated, tightly wrapping both her hands around her warm mug. Richard aggressively secured the massive house and the vast majority of the assets. The strict prenuptial agreement was absolutely not operating in my favor once all the horrific evidence of the fraud came out. I honestly did not know what to say to that, so I simply remained silent and waited. I have actively started attending intensive therapy sessions. She let out a short, almost hysterical laugh. It is the very first time in my entire life. As it brutally turns out, being raised as the flawless, golden child severely messes you up psychologically, too. Just in incredibly different, toxic ways. Is that statement supposed to manipulate me into feeling sorry for you? Absolutely not. She finally met my eyes directly. It is simply supposed to explain the situation. Not to excuse the horror I caused, just to explain it. She gently set down her coffee mug. I fully knew exactly what Dad was orchestrating behind the scenes. I explicitly knew. And I actively chose to remain completely quiet because I was utterly, paralyzingly terrified that if I ever spoke up and defied him, I would immediately lose my privileged place. I was terrified I would instantly become you. The invisible, discarded one. Her voice violently cracked. That is the absolute ugliest truth I have to live with. I comfortably watched my own sister suffer in agony, and I repeatedly told myself it was simply not my problem to solve. So, what exactly happens now? Victoria took a long, shaky, shuddering breath. Now I desperately try to rebuild myself into someone fundamentally different. I absolutely do not expect you to ever forgive me. I explicitly know I do not deserve it. But I desperately wanted you to know that I am profoundly, entirely sorry for absolutely all of it. I sat quietly and looked directly at my sister. Really, truly looked into her soul. I absolutely cannot forgive you yet, I stated firmly. But I am also not going to waste the rest of my life aggressively hating you either. It was definitely not closure, but it was undeniably something to build upon. Exactly 6 months later, the entire trajectory of my life looks completely, radically different. The massive estate was finally legally settled. I received my full, rightful financial share. It was absolutely not the staggering, multi-million-dollar fortune Victoria had initially, illegally inherited, but it was more than enough. It was enough capital to completely annihilate my debts. Enough capital to comfortably secure a massive down payment on a beautiful, modern condo. Enough capital to finally, truly feel like I could pull a full breath of oxygen into my lungs. But the influx of money is absolutely not what fundamentally changed my soul. I aggressively started attending intensive therapy. Real, agonizing, brutally honest, twice-a-week therapy sessions where I meticulously unpacked 32 years of being explicitly told my existence was not enough. It is incredibly hard work. Some days, I physically leave those sessions feeling as though I have been violently turned inside out. But I am aggressively learning about enforcing boundaries, about establishing unshakable self-worth, and about the massive difference between desperately trying to earn love and rightfully demanding basic respect. My mother and I casually grab lunch together every other week now. The dynamic is frequently incredibly awkward. We are both painfully learning how to be genuinely honest with each other after existing in a lifetime of suffocating silence. She is absolutely not the perfect, loving mother I always fantasized about having, but she is actively, genuinely trying to be the mother she should have been decades ago. Victoria recently mailed me a heartfelt birthday card last month. It was the very first one I had ever received from her. Tucked inside, she had handwritten, "I am still desperately trying to figure out exactly who I am outside of Dad's toxic shadow. I deeply hope you will eventually give me the time to prove it." I have absolutely not written her a response back yet, but I also did not throw the card into the trash incinerator either. Josephine has rapidly become family to me in the absolute truest sense of the word. She is the fierce, protective, and I absolutely never knew I desperately needed. The loyal ally I possessed no idea I had. We share dinner every single Sunday evening without fail. She tells me incredible, vibrant stories about my grandfather, and stories about the honorable father my dad theoretically could have been if he had not made such malicious, sociopathic choices. My close colleague, Julian, asked me a profound question just the other day. "Do you harbor any lingering regrets about how absolutely everything exploded?" I sat and thought deeply about his question for a very long time. "Absolutely no," I finally replied with a smile. For 32 entire years, I survived as a background character in someone else's horrific story. I blindly followed a toxic script I did not even realize was written. But now, I beamed. Now, I am finally, aggressively writing my own epic story. And honestly, it is the absolute first story I have ever genuinely wanted to read to the end. I have spent an incredible amount of time diligently working with my therapist, desperately trying to understand exactly how the foundation of my family became so irreparably shattered. I do not analyze this to ever offer them total forgiveness, though perhaps that elusive feeling will magically arrive eventually, but simply to make clinical sense of the madness and to aggressively ensure I absolutely never carry these toxic, generational patterns forward into my own future. Here is the unvarnished truth I have learned. My father was exactly what clinical therapists explicitly define as a malignant, narcissistic controller. He grew up as a highly privileged, solitary only child. He was aggressively handed absolutely everything he ever desired, and he fundamentally learned to view the entire universe as a brutal, zero-sum game. If someone else acquired more, it inherently meant he possessed less. When I was unexpectedly born, I was absolutely not viewed as a beloved daughter. I was instantly perceived as a massive, biological threat to the carefully curated resources he had exclusively earmarked for his golden child, Victoria. His psychological response to my existence was not active, burning hatred exactly. It was infinitely colder and more terrifying than that. It was purely calculated, sociopathic dismissal. My mother was a tragic victim of what experts define as severe, coercive psychological control. She married into massive, generational wealth originating from absolute poverty, and my father systematically, aggressively isolated her from any shred of independence, financial, social, or emotional. When he ruthlessly commanded her to treat me with freezing coldness, She simply did not possess the internal resources or the courage to resist his tyranny. That absolute fact does not make her horrific abuse acceptable, but it profoundly helps me comprehend exactly why she was paralyzed and couldn't protect me, even when a tiny part of her soul desperately wanted to. Victoria was the ultimate golden child, aggressively hoisted onto a glittering pedestal so incredibly high that she could completely no longer see the reality of the ground beneath her. She was systematically brainwashed from birth to believe that she inherently deserved the entire universe and that I inherently deserved absolute nothingness. Her cruelty was not inherent. It was meticulous, systematic programming. When you are continuously, aggressively raised to falsely believe the entire solar system actively revolves around your existence, watching your own sister suffer in agony genuinely feels like the natural order of things. And then there is me. I was the designated family scapegoat. I was the silent, invisible sponge who automatically absorbed the entirety of the family's toxic dysfunction so that everyone else in the house could comfortably pretend absolutely everything was flawless. My absolute biggest vulnerability was my stubborn, pathetic hope. The desperate, deeply irrational hope that if I just tried infinitely harder, loved them infinitely better, and sacrificed significantly more of my soul, I would finally earn my rightful place at their table. But here is the ultimate, brutal truth about desperately trying to earn love. You absolutely cannot do it. Genuine love is absolutely not a transactional wage. It is not something you actively deserve based strictly on your merit or performance. It is something that inherently should be given freely and unconditionally. And when it is maliciously withheld, that is absolutely not your inherent failure. That is entirely their catastrophic failure as human beings. The most profound, life-altering lesson I want to leave permanently embedded in your soul is incredibly simple. You are absolutely, entirely not responsible for the toxic dysfunction you were randomly born into, but you are 100% responsible for deciding whether you carry that poison forward into the future. I aggressively, consciously chose to shatter the cycle. You possess the exact same power to do it, too. So, that is the entirety of my story. It is absolutely not a petty revenge tale, even though I fully acknowledge it might sound exactly like one to outsiders. This entire, explosive ordeal was absolutely never about maliciously destroying my family structure or greedily taking everything they possessed. It was purely, entirely about the unvarnished truth. It was about 32 agonizing years of suffocating silence finally, violently breaking open. It was about a woman who spent her entire existence being completely invisible, finally, aggressively choosing to be seen by the world. My father meticulously wrote that horrific letter fully expecting it would remain buried forever. He obsessively kept that damning journal genuinely believing his toxic secrets would permanently die alongside him. He spent decades aggressively constructing a fabricated version of our family where my existence absolutely did not count. But here I am today, still proudly standing, still fearlessly speaking my truth, and violently refusing to ever disappear into the shadows again. If my harrowing journey taught me a single, undeniable truth, it is this: the specific individuals who aggressively try to make you feel microscopic are usually the ones who are the most utterly, paralyzingly terrified of what you will ultimately become when you finally discover the courage to stand up. So, please stand up. Even when the prospect is utterly terrifying. Even when absolutely everyone surrounding you aggressively demands that you keep quiet. Even when the very people who should biologically love you the most are the exact ones aggressively holding your head underwater. Your inherent, undeniable worth as a human being was absolutely never theirs to unilaterally decide. Thank you so incredibly much for staying by my side until the absolute end of this journey. I mean that truly, from the bottom of my heart. If this narrative deeply touched your soul in any capacity, please hit that like button. It aggressively helps more survivors find these specific videos, and I promise you, there are countless others out there who desperately need to hear this message. If you desire to hear more stories exactly like this one, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. I have linked several of my other, highly related videos down in the description box below. And if you harbor your own personal story of survival, regardless of whether you feel entirely ready to share it or not, please leave a comment. Let me know that you are out there. Let me know that you are aggressively fighting your own battles too. Please take absolute, uncompromising care of yourself, okay? And always remember, you are inherently always worthy.